So my eldest son's dad very sadly died by suicide 12 years ago. And I can't begin to imagine what that must have been like for him. There's so much misinformation out there. I mean, we don't really talk about death as in a society. The more you learn about grief and loss, you actually realise that there are so many other losses that we can experience in our lives, as something that really I hear it a lot. It's just so frustrating because what I see versus what people are saying is very different. So I hear people say, men aren't good at talking about their thoughts or their feelings or what's going on for them. So there's that real conflict of, when she did die, that there was the conflict because I didn't want her in pain anymore, but also I didn't want her not to be here anymore. And I think...
Hi, Emma. Welcome to the Never Fully Heard podcast. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, it's good to see you. Where I want to start the podcast is, when did you first understand what mental health even was?
I mean, it's a funny thing, isn't it? Because I think you've got an awareness of it, but it doesn't really get brought to your awareness until certainly in my case, so my eldest son's dad very sadly died by suicide 12 years ago. And I think that was really the moment, that it brought massively into my awareness that you can't avoid something like that. You've got to kind of face into it. And there was just this sudden realization of being a mum of two boys as well. I was like, I don't know enough about this for my own well-being, but also to think about how am I going to, help my children. So I think that was like a real key turning point for me to realize I need to know more about this.
Thank you for sharing. And was that like a fairly immediate reaction to look for help and figure out a way to get better at it, or did that take time?
Yeah, like many people who are bereaved by suicide or bereaved in general, you tend to get swept into doing things, so organizing things, doing things, and so you don't really have time to kind of process what's gone on. And I guess there's an element of shock as well. I think that's quite a common thing to experience. So it wasn't until kind of some time had passed and I was really kind of reflecting on what had happened and actually people's reactions to what had happened. And I just knew I had to learn more. So that was when I decided to just put myself on. It wasn't through work or anything like that. I just decided to put myself on a mental health first aid course, and I was like, right, I need to really focus on my eldest son, actually, that really wanted to kind of think how I need to learn about this. But what I noticed, and I think a lot of people do this, is when you go and learn about mental health and you do something like a mental health first aid course, you actually start realizing about your own mental health and well-being, and it really makes you have to think about that. And I think we spend so much time kind of avoiding thinking about that. I know I did. So yeah, I had to, sit for 2 days thinking about, mental health and my
Yeah.
mental health and what does this mean. So yeah.
Yeah, and how had it impacted your eldest son in that moment?
Oh gosh, I mean, it's very difficult. I can't really speak on his behalf, but I can't begin to imagine what that must have been like for him. I really can't. But what I do know now, and hindsight, it's a great thing, isn't it? But also it can be really cruel. And I think, some of the things looking back now, it probably wasn't that helpful. It was kind of trying to carry on as normal, and how can you do that? So we've done a lot of work together now around, being able to talk about what happened, and he's a lot older now as well, which makes a difference, but also remembering his dad as well. And I think a lot of people who have been bereaved, they don't have a lot of places or spaces where they can reminisce and remember someone who they've lost. So, and I think now I know that, and now I've learned what I've learned. If I could go back in time, and we can't, there's definitely some things that I would have changed around how I responded to that, which would have then potentially had an impact on how he was feeling and what was going on for him.
And has that changed how you've worked with people that have experienced bereavement since?
Yeah, massively, massively. You know, just there's so much misinformation out there. I mean, we don't really talk about death as in a society anyway, and you know, it's kind of the thing we don't want to talk about because a lot of people just want to focus on living, or so we tend to avoid that as a subject. So people who have been bereaved often feel quite isolated, quite alone, and there's some stuff that we say, I think sometimes it's like out of awkwardness. We don't really know what to say. You know, a lot of people that I speak to is like, oh, I wouldn't know what to say. And so they tend to say these things that we don't always think about, is that helpful or not? So, you know, things that have been said to me, for example, are things like, oh, well, he's in a better place now. And it's kind of like, it's not acknowledging how somebody really feels. It's almost like we're trying to move them out of how they really feel. And you know, all that does is make someone feel more isolated and more alone with their feelings.
And what would be a, because I'm sure that's just a case of in a lot of times not knowing what to say, and that being
Yeah,
almost like a cliche phrase, for lack of a better term. But what what's a better way to phrase that? What's a better way to acknowledge someone's emotions in that moment?
exactly as you said. Acknowledge the emotions. You know, I was feeling very sad. I was left with so many unanswered questions. And if somebody had acknowledged that and validated how I was feeling, rather than trying to get me to focus on something else more positive, I think that would really have helped me, you know, having that validation and being able to feel what I was feeling. And like most people, you know, what I ended up doing was just kind of suppressing how I was feeling and not really dealing with it. Yeah. So it would have, for what would I have liked? I would have liked someone to acknowledge how I was feeling, listen. Even if they'd said to me, do you know what, Emma, I don't know what to say, that would have felt kinder than some of the things that were said, you know?
Yeah, I can totally understand that. And what have you've gone on to go into coaching?
Hmm.
What was it that motivated you to want to be a coach and to help other people?
Yeah, I think seeing how, you know, how people are treated, and also recognizing through my own kind of journey of, you know, working with my own grief and my own losses. And you know, the more you learn about grief and loss, you actually realize that there are so many other losses that we can experience in our lives, you know, as well as bereavement. So when you really start looking at it, you know, there's quite a lot that people can work on within themselves. um, so I think that then made me realize, actually, you know, because of the work I'd done with myself and on myself, it made me feel hopeful that perhaps I could help other people. And that's what I'm doing. So, and, you know, it's a lot of people will say, oh gosh, you know, you work in grief and loss, and I do a lot of suicide prevention training for different organizations and things like that. And people are like, how can you do that all day? And actually, do you know what? It's really refreshing, because there's people just say how they feel, and the honesty, and there's something about sitting with somebody and the honesty of that. It's quite a privilege to sit with someone when they're able to be fully emotionally honest. So it's rare that we get those moments, I think.
100%. I think that is something that, yeah, that's yeah, really well described, that how amazing it is to have emotional intimacy. And
Mm.
the reason behind starting the podcast was because a lot of time I can only speak for my experience with my guy friends. I can't speak for, that's why I've kind of targeted it at men. And I know there is stats to show that male suicide
Mm.
is higher, but I know there's problems everywhere. But in terms of, yeah, the experiences, I think a lot of guys are crying out for more emotional intimacy. Not in the sense of, it's always spoken about like physical intimacy and hooking up, but I think a lot of guys are craving emotional intimacy, being able to have really honest emotional conversations with each other,
Mm.
about whether it's bereavement, whether it's about love, whether it's just about things they want. And I think, yeah, I just think there's such a space for more of these to be created, and it shouldn't always happen when something really bad has happened. It should also be happen when things are really good as well.
Yeah, and like while we're on that subject, Nick, there's something that really kind of, I hear it a lot, and it's just so frustrating because what I see versus what people are saying is very different. So I hear people say, oh, men aren't good at talking about their thoughts or their feelings, or what's going on for them. And that's really not what I'm seeing, when I'm training people in mental health first aid, suicide first, but also when I'm working with men working through their own losses and their own bereavement and their grief. Actually, that's not what I'm seeing. What I'm seeing is men being able to articulate how they're feeling and how they feel this pressure in certain spaces to have to conceal how they're feeling or to act or behave in a different way. So I think, what you're doing with this podcast is fantastic, because it's breaking down that stigma, and it's helping people to think about where are there maybe some safe spaces where they can go and talk, and they can, free from judgment. That's, wouldn't that be amazing to have spaces, free from judgment, where people, men, particularly, as you've said, around the statistics, we know more men die by suicide. It's so important to create those safe spaces. So if anyone is listening, and you're working in an organisation, thinking about that, where are the safe spaces for men in your organisation to be able to sit and talk about how they're feeling? Because we need more of those.
100%. There's a really interesting initiative in Australia, because they have a real problem with elderly loneliness, and they were running these like kind of coffee events, and loads of women would turn up, but they had a real problem with getting guys to turn up. And what one person did is they started like a tool shed, basically, where on the weekend or whenever, groups of guys meet up and basically just fix random things in this tool shed. And they basically had loads of guys flooding there, and in that environment they found that they were opening up about everything, their emotions, like everything that was going on in their lives that they had trouble with. They were starting to open up, and they found such a community in it. So I think as you said, it's not that, I guess, men are bad at doing it. It's just we haven't found as many good spaces for men to open up in. And I think it's just, yeah, the more people that can get involved in the space and create them, then I think it's just, yeah, so beneficial. But I thought that was a really interesting
Yeah.
example of it may just take a different
Yeah,
route.
exactly. And I think that, it's thinking creatively, isn't it? It's thinking, and asking people what they need as well. I think, as a society, we I think we assume a lot what people need, and it's, when actually we can ask that person, what do you need right now?
Mm.
And, going back to our conversation earlier around, if someone's bereaved or someone's going through some kind of loss of some kind, rather than stumbling and trying to work out what we should say, really simply being able to ask them, and what do you need right now? So yeah, that definitely works when we think about spaces. But yeah, the tool shed, that sounds very cool.
What would you say, what is the definition of grief?
Well, it's a very natural reaction for us when we have a loss of some kind. And I really want to stress that kind of natural reaction, because it is something that we do all experience, differently, of course. Everyone is unique. And often what we tend to find when we're grieving is that we will experience some form of conflict as well. So to give you an example, my nan, bless her, when she died, she was very ill, but she was an incredible person. She was one of those people that you would just want to pick up the phone and just chat about your day and stuff like that. Incredible woman. And so there's that real conflict of, when she did die, there was the conflict because I didn't want her in pain anymore, but also I didn't want her not to be here anymore. And I think that is what a lot of people experience when they're going through any kind of loss, is that conflict, those conflicting feelings. And that's what can cause this, emotional pain and difficulty that we experience.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And would you say there's any other conflicting, I guess, what are some unexpected emotions that people don't think they should be feeling during the grieving process?
God, well, there's all kinds of emotions, isn't there? I mean, we can also feel them all in one day as well. So, there's kind of anger, frustration, sadness, loneliness, and we can have moments of joy as well. When we think about those memories, and just thinking about a memory could take you through a whole range of different emotions. And the challenging thing is as well is if we aren't kind of working through those emotions, and we're not we haven't got those safe spaces to be able to talk about how we're feeling, we can push it down and push it down, and that sadness, that loneliness could come out as kind of that emotional snapping, that anger, that frustration. And then a lot of clients that I work with will then start asking the question, they'll kind of go, well, what's wrong with me? Why am I doing this? And so then we can feel that kind of
Mm.
distress as well around our own like feelings and thoughts. So yeah, it can be quite a range of emotions that people can experience.
Would you almost say you were grieving? Did you say your nan? Did you say were you almost grieving whilst she was alive?
That's a really interesting point around that, like, anticipation. So less so with my nan, but it's interesting that you mentioned that topic because my mum, she has terminal cancer, and a bit cheeky, but I do actually call her the Terminator because she's just doing so well. So she had her first diagnosis of breast cancer, it's probably about 16 years ago now. And then she had her secondary diagnosis, it's about 5 or 6 years ago. And, I remember us all being, going into the oncologist and having this kind of consultancy. And it was, we were reviewing medication and, drug trials and all of this kind of stuff. And, we were told that potentially it could be 6 months. And this was, 5, 6 years ago now. And that's definitely been a feeling for me, is that kind of, knowing that she's living with a terminal illness, and oh my goodness, she is the Terminator, right? Because she is here and doing really well. There are days
Mm.
when she, finds it really difficult, particularly the side effects and things like that. But knowing that you are going to lose somebody, it's really conflicting, really conflicting. So, and I also, we've just recently had the bereavement of my mother-in-law, and my mother-in-law had Alzheimer's. So that was another kind of that anticipation of that loss, and experiencing that loss of someone because a loss of their personality, loss of sense of who they are, who you remember them to be. So this just shows, doesn't it, how we can experience grief and loss in so many different ways. And the chances are someone you're working with, someone that's in your network, in your circle, is experiencing some form of loss of some kind, and they could be feeling, feelings of grief as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry to hear, but I'm glad that your mum is
She's
fighting
doing
strong.
great. Yeah, really good.
That is positive to hear. Yeah, it is such a conflicting process, and it's a really hard one. I mean, the conversation I had today was with a guy that was diagnosed with bipolar,
Hmm.
and he experienced a sense of loss of identity.
Mm,
He felt totally kind of like he was, yeah, out of touch with society. And it kind of brings back to this sense of community that I think people and just
mm,
all people in society are craving for, the feeling of being a part of something that people care for them. And he said something so touching. He was like, he was studying for his PhD, I think, at the time. And he said that because his researcher went out the way to recommend him as a research assistant for like a program, that because he realized someone cared about him, that was the reason that he didn't commit suicide. And it was just, yeah, such a moment to think how powerful it is just to be there for people and to tell people that you care about them. Because you never know when some of these tragic moments and illnesses that they can strike and they can come into your life and cause a lot of pain. So it's just, I think it really makes me reflect and think that whenever you get moments with your loved ones, just know they are tough in these circumstances, but just yeah, really be present and enjoy every moment you can.
mm. That power of connection, isn't it? Is, when you feel seen, when you feel heard, yeah, like you say, it can change you from not having hope and not seeing a way forward to then actually, having that hope and seeing a difference and having a purpose. So
Mm.
yeah.
And what you said before about having certain reminders of the person,
Mm,
and I think everyone does deal with grief in their own way. I remember I've still got I don't know what the word for it is, the card that is at a funeral that has kind of what
Like the service,
What?
yeah, on it. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I've still got that from my granddad's funeral, and I think it is. I d- I think with when my own experience of funerals is that it comes by really quickly, and
Mm,
it can be often the event. You're kind of keeping I guess a brave face is a word for it, but
mm.
more just you're in the moment, and then it's kind of afterwards, and the quiet moments was when I started to, I guess, kind of grieve myself. But it's what's are there different stages of grief? I remember seeing this online somewhere, but what are some of the different stages people go through in grief?
Yeah, and I'd say that there are the stages, and the stages of grief were really designed around somebody with a terminal illness, and they were kind of looking at it from that perspective. But I think there are different, emotions, feelings. I think thinking about what you were talking about there, and it's definitely a lot of work that I do when I'm working with clients one to one, is that we kind of look at society, we look at how the expectations of us. So, you were talking about, that pressure to be strong, and to kind of put this brave face on in front of our family and our friends and things like that. And then what we kind of learn is that we then, if we're going to grieve, that we should do that on our own. That's kind of what society kind of teaches us. That's how we should do it. And it can be so incredibly isolating. So, I hear this a lot from clients that I work with, from friends and family, where, they're almost not fully present at the funeral because they're working so hard to be what they think other people
Mm.
need them to be. So it's interesting to hear, different experiences and things like that.
Yeah, that is. I think that applies to life. I think I've heard that a lot, but that I can imagine that being the case that you only get hit by some people can only get hit by the grief once they've kind of managed to drop I guess the face that they were holding up, and eventually
Mm.
let the emotions get through to
Yeah,
them.
and there's a lot of healing in kind of having your feelings heard. This is, why people like me do the work that we do, and counselors, because that power of having your thoughts and feelings witnessed by another human being, that connection that we were talking about earlier, can be incredibly healing. So, if we're feeling like we can't share that with people, we can't share how we're feeling, that we've got to hide that away. And some people feel really ashamed of that. They feel, and I think this is, again, from working with a lot of men that I work with, is, I couldn't cry in front of my siblings because I needed to be that strong person. So, these kind of unspoken rules that are there, that are preventing people from being able to express their feelings and emotions in that moment, and then feeling as though they've got to do it on their own. Yeah, which is, really hard when we know there's so much healing in having your thoughts and feelings heard and witnessed by somebody else.
Mm. I wonder where that comes from. The sense of the man you spoke about there feeling like he needed to
Mm.
be the strong one for the his siblings there. I wonder where that comes from.
There's this terminology, is this phrase, isn't it? Be strong. And and I can say this after all of the kind of the work that I've done and the study that I've done. And so I guess I'm in a different headspace than if we'd had this conversation 12 years ago. But when I think about be strong now, I think actually being strong is being vulnerable, is being brave, is being able to say, actually I'm finding this really difficult. Whereas I think, some people have that perception of being strong means that I can't talk about my feelings, and it's a weakness to talk about how I'm feeling, or to cry in front of somebody else. So I think we need to kind of work on shifting that and actually helping people see that actually to be vulnerable and to be brave and to talk about your feelings, and if you need to cry, is to cry, and actually that can be being strong as well.
100%, 100% agree. And I don't know. I actually can't pinpoint where the phrase is, or if I've even and anyone's ever said to me that men shouldn't cry or man up. I can't
Mm,
pinpoint whether someone directly said that, but I think it would have been from
yeah.
just seeing different scenarios play out when I was younger, that I think it gets ingrained. And I also think the media doesn't help as well. Certain, like, looking back at certain classic movies, it's
Mm,
the old family dynamics definitely just play into how you perceive the society. But yeah, it's I don't th- I, yeah I don't think anyone in particular actually said those things, but you do. Speaking to my guy friends, you do all just have that innate sense that you do need to be tough and you shouldn't cry, and that crying is a bad thing. I think that that is something we've all like innately felt, but all feel like we'd still be there for each other, and we do still speak about it. But it's a weird one.
Yeah, yeah, and like you say, there's so much that can influence us. Like you say, TV, movies, role models that we've had, caregivers that we've had, and even when I think about it, when I was at school, when I was a kid, it's like, don't cry. We're told not to cry, isn't it? It's like that's one of those kind of stock phrases that we were talking about earlier, is that, especially in workplaces, it's kind of, oh, don't cry. Or I even remember, gosh, years ago, I used to deliver management training, and we were sort of talking, what do you do if somebody cries, and and you're like, well, they're one of your employees. And I remember we used to talk about, oh, well, just let them know that they can go to the toilet, kind of thing, almost like sending them to the toilet. And when I think about that now, I'm like, oh my goodness, we're essentially saying, please don't cry in front of me. Can you go to the toilet on your own and cry? So yeah, thank goodness things are changing. I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's the case with a lot of things. It's the workplace is a really interesting one, because I always think about how do people, I mean, I'm sure you've had to do this times throughout just different events in your life, and I can think of loads in mine and my friends' lives where you have to show up for work after like really crazy
Mm-hmm.
events. And you I mean, there is a sense of, I'm sure there could be people I could console him, but you also do just have to get on with it. And I think that's a real conflict that people have when they have to go through like a divorce, a bereavement. And then you have to go and almost like pretend to be upbeat and happy at work. And yeah, that must be so. Is that something you've worked with people on when they're going through the grieving process and they have to still carry on and manage their
Yeah,
life?
absolutely. And a lot of my clients will say, usually that there's a lot of, and kind of, this isn't the case for everybody, but I do see this as a trend when I'm working with people, is that there's a lot of care and attention around that bereavement, usually on the build up to the funeral. And then they kind of say, well, after the funeral, it's kind of like radio silence. And then, I think that I try to think that most people have good intention. That's how I try to live my life. And I think it's because we're a bit awkward, so as human beings. So we almost don't want to mention that person that's died, because we don't want to, we're like, oh, we might set that person off, or we might upset that person. So I think that can be one of the things that happens. So once the funeral's kind of happened, people they talk about how actually they feel even more alone, because all of the support has
Mm,
gone away. And
that's interesting.
they're not, and people feel awkward talking about the person that they've lost, so because they don't want to say the wrong thing, or they don't want to feel like they're bringing it up, when actually the truth is that person is probably thinking about their bereaved person, most days. So bringing it up, having a conversation, um you know the I had a client say to me once, they said, there's nothing you can say that's going to make this any worse, because the worst thing has happened, which really stuck with me.
God, yeah, that's powerful. Yeah, that it's so true, because there's no way that like almost an hour is going to go by where they're probably not thinking about the person or the situation, especially in the preceding months. And that feeling of, you have to, if no one's reaching out to you and no one's saying anything to you because they're afraid of
Mm.
saying the wrong thing, then you're having these endless thoughts without anyone
Hmm.
actually acknowledging them, because they're too afraid to say something. And yeah, God, that's really powerful. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and I think it's just having that awareness, isn't it? And I do think there's a lot more work to be done in workplaces. I'm seeing a lot of organizations thinking about their bereavement policy, because I think sometimes that can send the wrong message as well. It's kind of like, well, here you go, here's 3 days or 5 days. And it kind of gives that, well, there you go, there's your 5 days. Now get back to work. And
Yeah.
that's not how it works, when you live with that. And when I think about my eldest son's dad, he died 12 years ago, but my son has since got married, and it's those significant events that remind you again that this person isn't here, that they're not
Mm.
here for those moments. So it's not a time limited thing. It's not, oh, here we go, right now, crack on, back as you were, kind of thing. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah, I think it also just rings so true to having done this podcast. Just people are just always there's always something going on in people's life, and you never know what's going on behind closed doors or in their own mind. So just yeah, I think just the age old thing of just be kind to people, and
Mm,
also when people have a bad reaction, you just yeah having seen friends, a few of them that have had bad reactions or like been a bit kind of distant or snappy recently, you just having then found out what's going on, you just never know what people are going through. So I think it comes back to training people and them needing to be more awareness, whether it's like mental health first aid or other different parts of training,
mm.
because I just don't think people are equipped to know. I think there's a lot of managers out there who just aren't equipped to know what like how to deal with these situations and how to what to say to their employee when they've had a bereavement. If I mean
Because you're so right. Because I think, typically with managers as well, you're lucky if you do get training, right?
yeah.
Because you're given the job because you're good at the day job. So it's like, oh, here, have a team of people to go and manage because you were really good at that job. So rarely, you get the training. A lot of organizations do give training, but typically what managers do is they learn from their managers, right? So they're like, oh, well, this really worked for me, so I'm gonna use this with my team, and hopefully that will work. And sometimes that's really great, but also everyone's so different. So it's not always going to work. And I think that's how we can sometimes behave with, grief and loss is, oh, well, this is how people treated me, therefore that must be the acceptable thing, and that's how we treat everyone else. And until we break those cycles and we go, actually, that that was said to me and actually it wasn't very helpful, is there another way? What can I say that is more helpful? Yeah, unfortunately it's just going to keep going. So we do need to have, those conversations, and kind of raise that awareness, and to start getting people thinking about, what are you actually saying, and is this really what this person
Mm.
needs? What does this person need right now? Yeah, it's a tricky one.
Yeah, I mean, it's just got to start earlier in people's lives, hasn't it? Like the thinking about
Mm,
all the different conversations you've got to have over your life that are really tough conversations that life just doesn't prepare you for. It is
mm.
a minefield at times, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Um, yeah, I think, talking about, and that's why we just need to be more open, isn't it? We need to, I think we're afraid of talking about death and dying and loss. But like you say, if it's something that we talk about, and we talk about early on, and I know a lot of schools do, where, it's sort of part of that education, but also thinking about, what are we saying that's helpful, you know?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's one thing that I kind of want to finish on. It's the topic of not knowing what to say or feeling like you're going to offend someone or do something wrong, so not saying anything. I think it applies to mental health. I think it applies
Mm.
to questions about the topics that questions about sex, questions about addictions, questions about relationships, and there's so many different things that we all experience in our own heads or behind closed doors that we don't discuss outside. Once we leave the house, once we go into work or go into a social situation, all of these topics, which are actually the most painful or the most intense for everyone's lives, we have to pretend like they don't happen. And it's so, I find it
Mm.
very peculiar sometimes going into work, knowing, having got close to certain people and knowing what's going on in their lives, that it's for 60, potentially 50, 60% of people's lives, they experience all these things and we don't speak about it. It's just, it's the, yeah, I just find it very odd. But I think it's as long as there's more people being good role models and being open and honest and people are investing in training, then it hopefully should start to change. But yeah, that is something I find very odd about the world.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's something really empowering as well. So once you kind of have that awareness as to kind of what's helpful and what's not, you then start recognizing that it's okay to ask for what you need. Because I think this is a two-way thing. So it's kind of absolutely, we need to think, what does that person need? And we've spoken about kind of validating someone's emotions, giving them empathy, listening, rather than jumping in with those kind of those
Mm.
unhelpful, awkward statements that we tend to do. But I also think once you've got that awareness and you go, actually, let's be more helpful, I think it empowers you to then think, yeah, what do I
Mm.
need? What help do I need? What do I need right now? Actually, I need to pick up the phone and have a really good talk about what's going on in my life right now. So I think it helps people to help themselves as well by having that knowledge, because it's like, yeah, not only am I thinking about what do other people need, but now I can really think about what do I need. So yeah, I think,
Taking
yeah,
the
good
power
things can
back.
come out of that.
Thank you so much for coming on, Emma. That was an amazing conversation with some really beautiful parts, and thank you.
Thank you, Nick. And I think what you're doing is fantastic. So,
Oh, thank
getting
you.
people talking, and, as we've spoken about, having lost somebody to bereavement by suicide, and we've spoken about male suicides and things like that. I think, what you're doing, and talking and starting these conversations is exactly what we need. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Never Fully Heard podcast. If you enjoyed it, please just share it with a friend. I would love to get this to as many people as possible. Thank you.